Ethan floated down the landing shaft of the Aurora's whim, trying not to think about the fact that the gravity stabilizers had been acting up all morning, giving him the sensation that he was alternating between falling and bouncing on invisible springs. He cursed softly under his breath, which in the vacuum of space, or at least the artificially pressurized corridors of the ship, sounded more like a muttered symphony of panic than anything coherent. Note to self. Invent shoes with anti-gravity cushioning, he whispered, and promptly slipped on a patch of polished metal, catching himself with an ungraceful pirouette that would have earned a standing ovation in zero-gravity dance circles. He was a linguist, not a stuntman, and certainly not the type who could gracefully negotiate a first encounter with an alien civilization while doing a mid-air somersault. Yet here he was, being assigned to a planet no one on the research crew had ever seen up close, Lyrathia, whose orbital sensors had detected a structure so strange it made their telescopic data look like abstract art. The distress signal had been cryptic, a series of melodic pulses that defied human mathematical patterns, almost like someone was trying to communicate using musical chairs as a medium. Ethan had spent days trying to analyze it, only to realize he was getting as much understanding as a squirrel listening to Beethoven. The shuttle door hissed open, and the violet landscape of Lyrathia sprawled before him like a dream stitched together with shards of light. He stepped cautiously onto the spongy moss that covered the ground, the substance bouncing slightly under his boots as if it had a sense of humor. He couldn't help muttering, "I hope this isn't sentient," and then immediately scolded himself for talking aloud, because, of course, in science fiction, everything weird is probably alive. And judging by the way the moss quivered, he had just insulted it. From the distance, a figure emerged, tall and fluid, moving as if gravity were just a polite suggestion. Ethan squinted. She looked human at first, curves, a familiar gait, even her expressions, but her ears extended elegantly from the sides of her head, long and tapered, each end twitching independently with the precision of a symphony conductor's baton. Her eyes glimmered violet under the Lyrathian sun, reflecting amusement, curiosity, and something he couldn't quite name. The translator nestled in his earpiece sputtered in protest. Words were failing him before he'd even opened his mouth. Liara tilted her head. Ethan, feeling absurdly like a nervous teenager caught in a galactic staring contest, cleared his throat. "Oh, hello, I come in peace. I bring snacks." He waved his hand vaguely, unsure what an alien would consider edible or polite. Liara laughed, a sound like crystalline wind chimes shaken by a gentle breeze, and Ethan immediately regretted his choice of words. The translator, finally catching up, processed it. The human exhibits tentative humor, interesting. The alien woman walked closer, each step precise and deliberate, and Ethan noticed that her ears twitched in rhythm to his heartbeat, or maybe to his missteps. It was hard to tell. He tried to introduce himself properly. "I'm Ethan, linguist, explorer, occasional klutz." Liara's ears flicked in amusement, and she made a sound that could have been a chuckle or an approximation of hello, and for a moment, the tension melted. Ethan felt like he'd just successfully taught a cat to juggle. She gestured, and holographic panels of light flickered around them, showing what he guessed were historical records or personal logs, all written in the swirling glyphs of her civilization. Ethan squinted, leaning in to examine them, and jokingly muttered, "If I translate this wrong, I hope I don't accidentally declare war." Liara's ears flicked sharply at his words, a subtle snort escaping her lips, or maybe it was just the wind. Ethan found himself slipping into rhythm with her, pointing at symbols and mimicking the sounds she made, each attempt making her laugh in ways that echoed across the mossy landscape. At one point, he bent down to touch a glowing crystal embedded in the ground and promptly recoiled when it pulsed against his fingers. "Okay," he admitted aloud, "maybe that one is alive. Definitely judging me." Liara tilted her head again, clearly enjoying his discomfort, and Ethan realized she wasn't just amused. She was studying him, testing him, and possibly deciding whether humans were as hopelessly charming as they appeared in legends. The first night on Lyrathia arrived with a lavender sky streaked by twin moons, and Ethan, feeling like he had survived a full day of awkward interstellar diplomacy, tried to explain human humor in the most concise way possible. Liara listened, ears flicking in rhythm, then tilted her head and asked, Are you speaking the language of legendary warriors? Ethan paused, unsure whether to take offense, but her smile, wry, knowing, impossible to misread, made him chuckle. Legendary warriors, huh? Maybe. Depends on whether they trip over their own feet and joke about sentient moss. She laughed again, the sound vibrating through the air in a way that made him forget the alien architecture, the looming unknowns, and the slight fear that he was the most ridiculous ambassador humanity had ever sent. For the first time, Ethan felt a bridge forming between their worlds, built on humor, curiosity, and a shared willingness to embrace the absurdity of first contact. By the end of the night, they sat atop a hill of violet stone, watching bioluminescent rivers shimmer below. Ethan tried, unsuccessfully, to demonstrate human storytelling magic tricks, which involved wild gestures and bizarre sound effects. Liara's ears twitched with delight, and she mimicked his gestures, making him nearly fall off the rock laughing. They weren't just two beings from different worlds anymore, they were collaborators, testing the waters of understanding, one awkward, funny, and strangely touching moment at a time. And as the violet moons cast long shadows across the moss, Ethan realized that Lyrathia was less about danger and more about discovery. Somehow, amid the alien ears, glowing glyphs, and living landscapes, he had stumbled into the first conversation of what could become a legendary story, one punctuated by humor, empathy, and the tentative, thrilling bridge between human and alien minds. Ethan stepped off the shuttle, wobbling slightly as the anti-gravity stabilizers hummed beneath his boots. Liara was already waiting, her long ears arching in perfect synchronization, giving her an almost regal yet playful look. The floating city hovered above the violet seas like a constellation pulled down to brush against the planet's surface. Each tower was crystalline, refracting the pale light of Lyrathia's twin suns into a kaleidoscope that danced across Ethan's wide-eyed face. He muttered, "I hope these things are structurally stable, or at least polite if they collapse." Liara's ears twitched sharply, and she made a sound that translated roughly as humor in the face of danger is tolerable. Ethan grinned, realizing he was already one step closer to speaking her language. As they approached the first tower, panels of floating light flickered along the path, illuminating symbols that pulsed faintly, as though the city itself were breathing. Ethan extended a hand to touch one, only for it to vanish like a mirage. "So, the city has a sense of humor too?" he said. Liara tilted her head, her ears flicking, and let out a musical laugh that made the floating lights shimmer brighter. Ethan chuckled, "Great, even the architecture is judging me." They reached the central plaza, a space suspended hundreds of meters above the violet seas, where energy ribbons coursed through the air like living veins. Liara gestured and holographic projections appeared, depicting warriors from her planet's history, moving in perfect harmony, their long ears, helmets, and weapons all exaggerated in artistry. Ethan blinked. Legendary warriors, huh? I half expected them to be practicing synchronized swimming in the air. Liara's laughter twined with the electric hum of the plaza, making him feel both ridiculous and welcome. She spoke a word, and the air around them vibrated, echoing in a way that seemed to resonate with the very molecules of his body. Ethan repeated it cautiously, mimicking the rhythm as best he could, only to produce a sound that made the holographic warriors pause and tilt their heads like tiny glowing judges. Liara's ears flicked in amusement and she said, "Close, more honor, more mischief." Ethan blinked, then said, "Ah, so it's like telling a joke while fencing with a laser sword." Liara's laughter spilled into the plaza, a sound so pure it made the energy ribbons pulse brighter. Ethan spent the next hour testing sounds, gestures, and absurd metaphors, each time eliciting flicks of her ears, smiles, or musical chuckles. At one point, he accidentally tripped over a hoverstep panel, and instead of falling, the panel gently flipped him upright with a soft hum. A self-righting floor, brilliant. "I'll call it the clumsy human protocol," he said, bowing theatrically to Liara, who mimicked him perfectly, ears arching in mock solemnity. Liara led him through the city, explaining in gestures and musical tones the philosophy embedded in the legendary warrior language. It wasn't just words, it was motion, rhythm, subtle pauses that conveyed courage, irony, and delight. Ethan tried to copy, flailing his arms in what could loosely be interpreted as valor, while Liara's long ears quivered with laughter. "Not bad for someone who probably trips over their own shadow," she teased. He bowed again, mock humility in every wobble. They stopped before a great observation deck where a crystal bridge stretched across the violet sea. Ethan peered over the edge, and the currents below shimmered with bioluminescent fish that seemed to trace patterns in sync with the city above. So, we're floating, the sea glows, and the air itself talks. Any chance this place comes with a user manual? He asked. Liara tilted her head, her ears twitching in amusement. The city is the manual, she said, and Ethan wasn't sure whether that was comforting or terrifying. He chose to laugh anyway. Then she began to teach him through storytelling, a combination of gestures, glyphs, and melodic inflections. She recounted the deeds of ancient warriors, how they had negotiated peace with rival tribes using riddles, tricks, and clever humor instead of brute force. Ethan realized that this wasn't just about battle. It was about understanding, empathy, and ingenuity. He tried telling a small human story in return, about a legendary knight who once accidentally jousted a windmill, which earned him a legendary reputation for bravery and comedic timing. Liara's ears quivered with delight, and she made a chirping sound that Ethan assumed was laughter. As the sun set, painting the twin moons in streaks of violet and gold, Ethan attempted a long warrior phrase. He stumbled, mispronouncing half of it but gestured grandly, making an overly dramatic bow at the end. Liara's laughter rang out across the plaza, echoing in the crystalline towers, and then she corrected him gently, showing him subtle shifts in inflection. He tried again, exaggerating his gestures for comic effect. I think I just invented interpretive dance as a universal language, he said, and Liara's ears flicked in perfect rhythm, a silent acknowledgement that in this moment humor and understanding had become one. They paused at the edge of the city, watching the twin moons reflect off the violet seas. Ethan couldn't stop marveling, not at the technological wonders, but at the way Liara had made him feel like his human quirks weren't weaknesses. They were tools, bridges, jokes that connected him to her world. He joked about writing a guidebook titled How to Trip Your Way into Galactic Diplomacy, which earned him a melodic laugh from her, her ears flicking in amusement. Then came the subtle tension. A distant hum of energy, a low vibration running through the crystalline towers. Ethan tensed. Liara noticed and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, her ears brushing back slightly. Do not worry, she said, though the tone carried weight. Ethan attempted to make a joke. I'm sure it's just a polite city complaining about my storytelling. She laughed, but it was quieter now, aware that the laughter was a small shield against something larger, something unseen. Ethan realized that in this floating city, amidst alien warriors, melodic glyphs, and violet seas, the real discovery wasn't just technological marvels. It was the connection forming between them. Humor was their common ground, curiosity their compass, and the language of legendary warriors a bridge spanning stars. He stumbled again, this time on purpose, and bowed deeply. Liara mirrored him, ears flicking proudly, as if acknowledging that he was no longer merely a human visitor. He was a participant, a co-creator in the story of Lyrathia. As the violet moons rose higher, their reflections dancing on the crystalline towers, Ethan whispered, half to himself, half to her, I think I'm starting to speak your language, maybe even correctly for the first time. Liara's ears twitched with amusement, and she replied in the warrior tongue, but the meaning was clear, carried not in words but in laughter and gesture. We understand each other. And in that shared moment, above violet seas, amid floating towers, and in the laughter of two improbable friends, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The storm hit without warning, a crackling fury of ionized energy sweeping across the floating city with an almost playful malice. Ethan grabbed onto the nearest crystal railing, which shivered under the surging currents, and yelped, Well, this escalated faster than my last interstellar coffee spill. Liara appeared at his side, long ears flicking sharply as she assessed the chaos. Do humans always make jokes when facing imminent death? She asked, tone curious but threaded with amusement. Ethan flailed his hands dramatically. Only when we're panicking or when gravity is being passive-aggressive. She let out a laugh that somehow harmonized with the storm, and even the energy ribbons seemed to dance in response, bending and twisting in strange, beautiful arcs. The twin moons above were partially obscured by blackened clouds, casting a surreal glow over the violet seas. Ethan squinted, trying to calculate a safe route back to the central tower. Okay, so I've got about 30 seconds before. Wait, how fast are you aliens at math? Liara's ears twitched. Faster than most humans, slower than reckless humans, she said. Ethan nodded solemnly. Also, I've still got a fighting chance. They moved together across the swaying platform, dodging arcs of raw energy that split the air with sharp, metallic snaps. Ethan attempted a human tactic he'd read about in old Earth adventure stories. Distracting the enemy with humor. Hey, Stormy, over here, look at me, I'm waving my arms like a confused windmill. Liara's ears flicked back, amused, but also with an almost imperceptible warning. Ethan realized the storm was less sentient and more mischievously reactive to energy manipulations from the city's core. He crouched and poked at one of the stabilizer conduits, mimicking a chef stirring an overly violent pot. Sparks danced around him and he grinned. Well, at least it's interactive. Liara adjusted her gestures, and with a series of swift, flowing movements, she synchronized the city's energy ribbons to form a protective lattice over their platform. Ethan, squinting at the glowing mesh, said, "So, you just basically turned the city into a giant lightning cage. Remind me never to bet against your people." She flicked her ears in acknowledgement and added a small flourish, directing the energy with a motion so fluid it seemed like she was conducting the storm itself. Ethan tried to mimic her, waving his arms in exaggerated circles. One ribbon reacted by looping around him, lifting him briefly before depositing him unceremoniously on his feet. Perfect human storm dance. 10-10 would recommend. They moved as a unit, balancing their respective strengths. Liara with her mastery of energy flows and warrior language gestures, Ethan with his improvisational problem-solving and unintentional comedic timing. At one point, he tripped over a loose crystal fragment, yelping as he rolled under a crackling ribbon. Liara's laughter followed him, and when he emerged, she was holding out her hand with mock patience, ears flicking like impatient conductors. "I'm beginning to think humans invent chaos on purpose," she said. Ethan bowed dramatically. "I prefer the term creative experimentation, thank you very much." The storm's peak coincided with the city's core, emitting a pulsing resonance, as though it were speaking in the language of the legendary warriors themselves. Liara whispered phrases to the energy, her voice blending with the harmonic vibrations. Ethan, realizing instinctively that he needed to contribute, attempted to echo the same phrases in his best approximation of warrior speech. The combination, Liara's practiced flow and his imperfect but earnest sounds, created a resonance that stabilized the platform, forming a protective sphere around them. Sparks danced harmlessly along the edges and the violet sea below shimmered with reflected light. Ethan wiped his brow, grinning. "We just talked the storm into submission. I think that's a first for humanity." As the storm dissipated, leaving a calm violet glow in its wake, Ethan and Liara looked out over the floating city. The energy ribbons settled back into their graceful arcs, the towers humming gently as if nothing had happened. Ethan realized how much he had changed. From a nervous linguist unsure of himself, he had become a participant in something far greater, a human whose curiosity, humor, and willingness to embrace the unknown had become crucial. Liara, long ears flicking with quiet approval, said, "You have grown not just in skill but in understanding. You see beyond words, beyond chaos, you see connection." Ethan scratched his head. "So I'm heroic now or just lucky?" She tilted her head, her smile teasing. "A little of both, but mostly understanding." They descended to the central plaza, where holographic projections of the legendary warriors shimmered in the settling calm. Ethan approached them, speaking in the warrior language, this time with confidence tempered by his human quirks. He recounted the story of their battle with the storm, adding exaggerated flair and comedic touches. Liara listened, ears twitching, and the hologram seemed to shimmer in approval, almost as if the city itself recognized his effort. He realized that the legendary language wasn't just about accuracy, it was about intent, creativity, and the ability to connect across cultures, even species. Ethan found a quiet spot overlooking the violet sea, sitting beside Liara as the twin moons reflected golden streaks across the waters. He realized that humor had become their bridge, courage their language, and curiosity their compass. He turned to her, saying, "I never thought I'd survive Lyrathia without tripping over everything, but somehow, I feel like I belong here, not just as a visitor but as part of the story." Liara's ears flicked, brushing against his shoulder in an almost imperceptible gesture of camaraderie. And you do, she said. Stories are not only written by history or warriors, they are written by those who dare to connect, who dare to laugh even in the face of chaos. He chuckled. Then consider me a professional storyteller, clumsy, maybe, but professional. Liara laughed, a melodic sound that made the violet sea shimmer in response. Together, they watched the calm waves, the floating towers, and the twin moons, understanding that the storm had tested more than their reflexes. It had tested trust, improvisation, and the willingness to embrace the absurdity of life. Ethan realized he no longer feared the unknown. He had discovered that even across galaxies, laughter, curiosity, and empathy could form a bridge stronger than any technology. He had grown, not just in skill, but in perspective, learning that heroism was often found in connection rather than conquest, in playfulness rather than perfection. Liara tilted her head, ears flicking gently in the soft wind, and Ethan smiled, knowing that their story, this improbable friendship, this interstellar partnership, was a legend in the making. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the violet skies, Ethan stood beside Liara, feeling both a part of her world and proud of what he had brought from his own. Humor, understanding, and courage had carried them through storms, both literal and metaphorical, and in their laughter they had forged a language of shared experience that would last across stars. Ethan whispered softly, "We did it, didn't we?" Liara's ears flicked, a gentle acknowledgement. Yes, together. And in that moment, the adventure that had begun with a stumble, a joke, and a question about legendary warriors found its full resolution. Two beings from different worlds, united in understanding, ready to face whatever came next with humor, bravery, and mutual respect.